Hello and welcome. You are with Argumentative Indians, and I am Bhuvan Apurva Jha. As climate change impacts accelerate, it can be expected that the costs and burdens of climate change will be disproportionately impact those who have been rendered most vulnerable given the accumulated weight of history. Amongst the many facets of climate justice, redistribution and corrective justice have been met with much opposition by the high-income developed countries, the global north. The low-income and middle-income countries, the global south's contention is that the rich nations, owing to historical opportunities, have had the lion's share when it comes to using resources to pursue unchecked economic growth and thereby contribute to global pollution. And thus, they have an obligation, not least by providing compensation for the high costs that global warming and climate change have already imposed on the developing and vulnerable nations. Dear viewer, the world today faces twin debt crises. On the one hand, a well-publicized financial debt crisis looms for countries across the global south, limiting governments' abilities to take action in public health, alleviate poverty, adapt to a warming world, or pursue ambitious low-carbon developmental programs. Policymakers in the rich world seldom discuss the other debt crisis, the ecological and economic impacts the global north owes for historical and ongoing plunder, extraction, and climate pollution, thereby threatening the lives of millions, all of which are key components driving the financial debt crisis. These intertwined crises require urgent action beyond the paltry steps taken since the start of the pandemic and over and above the ambitious Green Climate Fund. However, the rich countries have consistently dismissed the suggestion, claiming that corrective justice argument conflates the current generations with previous generations. Another counter-argument is that a full accounting of the historical benefits accrued to the poor and developing countries due to the global north's industrial development may paint a completely different picture. While the proposed Green Climate Fund with its ambitious goals is yet to fully take off, time is running out for those who are positioned at the forefront of this war against climate change. Urgent corrective action, reparations, and redistribution may well be the last hope for many threatened and vulnerable communities worldwide. Will the global leadership forge a consensus on the way ahead, or will the polluter pays principle remain limited to mere lip service? To discuss the multifaceted topic, should the rich world foot the climate bill, I'm joined by a distinguished set of panelists this evening on Argumentative Indians. Dr. Navroz K. Dubash, Professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. Dr. Benoit Mayer, an Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Ms. Stuti Mishra, the India Correspondent for The Independent, with a special focus on climate crisis and economy. Ms. Esther Stanford Jose, who will be joining us, I'm sure, who has in fact joined us from Stop the Mangamazi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide Campaign, and Mr. Joe Thwaites, International Climate Finance Advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us this evening at Argumentative Indians. Now, to all those of you watching, I will freely admit that the topic we are discussing today is a wide one with many different linkages. However, I do hope to present before you a comprehensive analysis of the climate debt debate through the expert views of our panelists. We will endeavor to discuss the past, the historical reasons that has led us to the issue of climate debt and justice, the present, ways and means through which the global community can mitigate the effects of climate change, including those who have suffered loss and damage from climate-induced events, and the future. How can the world come together to build climate adaptive and resilient systems and combat what is surely one of the biggest crises before humanity? On that note, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin my discussion with Ms. Stuti Mishra, and particularly with reference to South Asia. Now, Ms. Mishra, South Asia has always been the victim of hostile climate, but this year has been one of the worst so far on record. First, you had India and Pakistan that were hit by the worst heat wave on record, and then monsoon on steroids, as some experts have chosen to term it as, has ravaged almost one-third of Pakistan. The long-term melting of glaciers of the Himalayas are also a grave area of concern. Ms. Mishra, in the context of South Asia, described as one of the climate crisis hotspots globally, what have you observed during the course of your reportage? And does this region have the capability to deal with such catastrophic events going forward?
Right, thank you. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me. Like you said, actually, this year has been unlike any other. Constantly, with all the extreme weather events, we have been sort of back to back describing things as record breaking, unprecedented. The impact we have seen has been on a very massive scale. And while, like you said, this region has had been facing series of disasters, and the weather events we face tend to be on the harsher side. And we do see a lot of human cost and financial cost every season, every single year. This year did really actually, in a way, bring people together to discuss how climate is playing a role and how things are actually becoming so bad that it may not be, in our own capacity to continue dealing with it. And recently with Pakistan floods, I think the discussion has really come down to where it should have been, and how the Pakistan government has been talking about it, has been calling it. Specifically, they are asking for reparations, they are talking about climate finance, they are holding rich countries responsible. So that has really brought attention back to where it should have been, which is climate finance and also loss and damage. And also just the whole holistic nature of how we should be looking at this climate justice aspect, or maybe some people would like to call what climate injustice is towards the countries in the global south. So I think with Bangladesh and with India floods, we didn't really see this kind of language coming out as strongly. It was definitely something where climate did have a role, but with Pakistan floods, at least the arguments that are being put across are actually very much in line with what discussions we have been having in international climate negotiations, and what the countries were planning to go forward with at COP27. So there is definitely a momentum that is built up ahead of COP27. Now, it's not really a very straightforward situation. It's not like people are going to demand a loss and damage fund and then everybody's just going to agree. So obviously there are going to be negotiations. There's also discussion that if it's going to be one of the focus points, which it should be, but then again, yet to be seen that how much focus is put on it, and at the same time, how much result actually comes out of it. Because previous discussions, as experts have been telling me, again, I'm just a science communicator. I listen to experts and I try and break down it for people. And what everybody has been saying, that those discussions were not up to the mark. They did not really do anything for Global South, and they haven't really been able to enforce that climate finance will be available to the Global South, and as much as it is required, because the figures already are very, uh, conservative estimates. They don't really cover as much as is needed by countries here, and the kind of bills and the kind of losses they are seeing. Like with Pakistan floods, the damages are like over 30 billion. Estimates say that it's over 30 billion that Pakistan has already lost. Also, with like 1,400 people dying, 33 million people, 1 in 7 Pakistanis affected. Anything like this happening in a global north country would have actually been a very big deal. Like, a lot of people were also comparing that, oh, the area that is inundated in Pakistan is actually 3 times the size of Portugal, and nothing like that would have actually gone out of the news cycle, or like been actually like forgotten at all if it happened anywhere in the Europe, in Americas, or in like any other rich country. But before Pakistan, we saw floods and a lot of damage in Afghanistan as well. We saw that in Bangladesh as well. We saw it in Northeast India as well. Nothing really basically was covered in a manner as it would have in a different country. So with Pakistan, at least I feel like there is a discussion. I really hope it remains in an upward trajectory, and going ahead in COP, people are still talking about it. But then, yes, like a lot of things are still like about how things, transpire from here onwards. So yeah, I will let my opening arguments end here, but definitely looking forward to hear what everyone else thinks.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Mishra. Let me bring in Professor Navroz Dubash. Professor Dubash, you have researched and written extensively on climate change, energy, and the politics of regulation in the developing world. You are also one of the co-authors of the latest IPCC report and the coordinating lead author of Chapter 13 in the report. In your experience, is there a valid case for the rich countries owing a climate debt to the low-income poor countries? Does the research corroborate any of that?
Well, thank you. Let me echo Stuti in thanking you for inviting me to this panel, Apurv, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues. I just want to say that I believe many of my colleagues on this panel are actually better placed to comment on the very specific question that you've asked, and that's the focus of this panel, in the sense that I believe many of them focus much more directly in their work on questions of adaptation, on questions of impacts and redistribution, and how in fact we insulate and compensate people for these impacts. You alluded to the IPCC report. Indeed, I was a coordinating lead author, but I was the working group 3 on mitigation. So less on some of the issues of this panel. I will say that at a personal level, I feel quite strongly that those who are most affected by climate impacts, and Stuti has given us a nice sort of, a comprehensive view of what has happened in South Asia recently, as did you, Apurv, that the most vulnerable are the ones least responsible for the accumulated emissions. So just in the case of India, which is my country, the country I know best, we have contributed about 4.5% of global cumulative emissions, and we are 17% of the global population. And so if there is a remaining carbon budget, and the science tells us that it is a finite budget and that we have to move very fast if we are to limit the worst effects of warming, then not only is there a case that that budget should be allocated to those who need the carbon most in the short run, but there is a case that because the preponderance of what has been emitted so far was emitted by the global north, that they should bear the primary responsibility for making sure that those who are vulnerable have the resources with which to adapt, as well as be compensated in the form of loss and damage and so on. So I think the principle of this is very hard to argue with it. The practical politics, of course, is another matter at a time when the West itself is feeling in the grip of an energy security crisis, when there are security issues going on between Ukraine and Russia, global growth is slowing down. But I don't think we should conflate those practical political issues with the principle. I think we have to start by at least kind of trying to come to agreement on the principle. And I think that's clear that those who had the least to contribute shouldn't be at the forefront of bearing the brunt of climate change. I'll just maybe say one more thing before pausing. What I would particularly like to bring to this conversation is that while the equity question is central, of course, to impacts, adaptation, loss and damage, and so on, it is also deeply relevant to questions of mitigation. That is, how do we try and reduce the impacts of climate change? How do we ameliorate the situation to the extent we can? And the reason for this is that adaptation is critically important because it's very clear that we can't mitigate enough to avoid harmful effects. In fact, we've already probably seen those harmful effects. But by the same token, adaptation isn't enough because we can't possibly adapt to an unmitigated warming world. So we have to mitigate as well. So there's kind of the more we take our foot off the pedal on mitigation, the worse are the effects, the more the injustice, and the more the need for adaptation. So we have to focus on both. But mitigation itself brings a set of justice concerns. The transaction costs of countries turning to a low carbon future. Over what time period should they turn to that future? By when should they achieve net zero? And is that even the right question to be asking as opposed to short-run implications? What are the co-benefits that countries face from some low carbon actions? And to what extent are these actions that they wouldn't otherwise have taken? These are all sort of interesting and important questions that bring the question of equity in mitigation into focus. And while it may not be the central theme of this panel, I think it would be useful to spend a little bit of time also on that. So I just want to put that on the table. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Professor Dubash. And it's interesting that you mentioned the whole discussion around mitigation and adaptation. I'm sure we'll get to build on that a lot more in the course of the discussion. But for the time being, can I have Ms. Esther Stanford Kose? You have campaigned for a wider definition of when it comes to climate justice. Ms. Kose, what would the contours of your arguments be when we discuss that should the rich world actually owe a climate debt to the poor countries, the global south?
Yes, I mean, the focus at this time, you'll often hear terms like climate reparations. I think that only speaks to part of the issue, because actually it's not about the climate alone. We're talking about parts of the world, regions predominantly in the global south, that have experienced centuries of dispossession, enslavement, colonialism at the hands of European nations, corporations, and so forth. And so really, we cannot just look at what's happening in terms of the climate and ecological crisis. We have to look at what has made parts of the world, regions of the world, unable to effectively mitigate and engage in transformative adaptation, because they are denied access to resources that have been looted and are actually what are causing the so-called rich nations of the world to be in the condition that they are in, where they're much better prepared to effectively mitigate and adapt to the climatic and ecological impacts that we are facing. So holistic reparations are what's really key. And that goes beyond even this notion of loss and damage, which doesn't always take into account what are deemed to be non-economic losses and damage, such as huge losses of life, you know, the destruction of heritage and culture that has been built up over centuries. So that's the key thing. And I think what we need to recognize is that this is part of more long-standing demands that have been made from particular countries, regions, peoples, and nations for holistic, or what's known as full repair or reparations. And this is very much connected to, if we look at the beginnings of this crisis, which we can chart back to the Industrial Revolution and how that was developed as a result of the massive people trafficking and kidnapping of Africans, you know, which included forms of genocide, genocide of indigenous peoples of the so-called America, colonization of Asia and other parts of the world, and all of these were interconnected. So this is a long-standing demand that every generation, certainly speaking as an African reparationist, of people from my community, have been making these arguments, you know, around repair that are not being listened to. And so it's not just about the climate, it's not just about the debt crisis, it's about the holistic situation that we find ourselves in, where there are these huge inequalities and this global power that has been amassed that actually is also about the power to deny those of us who are entitled to a redistribution and restitution of resources that continue to be pillaged, that we need to be redirecting to actually ensuring that we're able to sustain ourselves and engage effectively in transformative adaptation.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Stanford Kose. Again, let me go across to Mr. Joe Thwaites. Mr. Thwaites, you have had a massive experience when it comes for persuasion for a more proactive international climate financing model. What would your take be on whether the rich countries do owe a climate debt to the poor countries? And I'd also like to get a sense from you as to why the opposition, the perceived opposition to this argument in the West. What's the main reason behind that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's great to hear this discussion so far, and really looking forward to getting into it more. And I think however one calculates it, and there are a ton of technicalities that you can get into, but it is clear, as I think all the other panelists have said so far, that the rich countries, the richest countries today, have been responsible for the lion's share of accumulated greenhouse gas emissions, and that it's been profits from exploiting fossil fuels, but also, as Esther mentioned, from colonialism, from slavery, that has made them the wealthiest economies today. On the other side, as Navros mentioned, the poorest countries have done the least to cause the climate crisis, but they're hit first and worst by the impact. So this is a grave injustice. The world's richest and most polluting countries certainly have a huge moral responsibility to provide finance and other forms of support and restitution to help developing nations deal with climate change. And it's one of the core principles of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement that was negotiated under it, which is the idea that all countries have a common concern in addressing the climate crisis, but that developed countries have a particular responsibility to provide finance, technology, and capacity building support. And this is known as common but differentiated responsibilities, and it's a real cornerstone of the UN climate regime. So I work at the Natural Resources Defence Council, which is an environmental advocacy organisation. And one of the things that we lobby and push for is getting rich countries, and particularly the United States, which is where I'm based, to fulfil these responsibilities to support poorer countries in addressing climate change, including through providing climate finance. But as you asked, and I'll be frank, that despite the clear moral responsibility and legal obligations, indeed, under the UN Convention on Climate Change, getting rich countries to meet their climate finance commitments is not easy. Climate finance is starting to gain more support from voters in rich countries, but political leaders in those countries have largely lacked the courage and vision to prioritize it over domestic matters. There's a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's not seen as a priority. It's seen as politicians generally as sort of focused on domestic issues first and foremost. But there's also a bunch of other sort of arguments, and it'd be great to get into it later in the discussion. But in terms of where that leaves us, well, first of all, I think we need to be continuing to push rich countries to fulfill their responsibilities, to make it more of a political priority. And part of that will be using arguments about why it's in their enlightened self-interest, that no country is immune to impacts, and that we're in an interconnected world. What happens on one side of the planet reverberates all over. But second, investing in climate action is certainly expensive, but as I think we all can probably agree, the costs of inaction are far greater, and that investing in low carbon development is increasingly cheaper than following a fossil fuel business as usual. And so there are some instances where, even if the rich world does not foot as much of the bill as they ought to, it can still make sense for poorer countries to make the investments if they can. And that's a big proviso, is if they can. With adaptation, it's a lot more tricky. Adaptation tends not to generate revenues the way that, say, renewable energy can, but it can still yield net benefits. And the Global Commission on Adaptation found that the net benefits could be 4 times the cost of implementing adaptation measures. And indeed, the Paris Agreement recognized that the fact that the climate crisis is so urgent that all countries need to do as much as possible to address the threat, to transform to low emissions, climate resilient societies. But getting back to the original question, there is a need to recognize that for many countries, there are fundamental constraints to them being able to raise the finance needed to make climate investments. So it's not merely a matter of them not having political will, or this will save you money in the long term. If you can't afford things up front to make these investments, they just won't happen. And that's where international support is absolutely vital, and the richest have a responsibility to provide that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Thwaites. And lastly, I'd move on to Professor Benoit Maire. Thank you for your patience, Professor Maire. But let's get your sense on, should the rich world owe a climate debt to the poor? developing countries. And when Mr. Thwaites talks about the legal implications behind getting these developed countries to fulfill their side of obligations and their inability to meet their obligations, how do you read that? How do you respond to that?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going indeed to focus a bit more on the legal side because I'm a law professor. That's really the thing I know. But I fully agree with the moral argument which my co-panelists have made. So I'm going to speak about what the law says as opposed to what I think should be done. So what the law says, if you look at the climate treaties, I don't see any evidence of an obligation of rich countries to pay damages to developing countries. There is no such obligation in climate treaties at the moment. Perhaps there should be, but there is no such obligation at the moment. Climate treaties tend to focus on mitigation, and there are some obligations in this regard. There are some vague obligation adaptation and a vague concept, ill-defined concept of loss and damage, which I think from negotiations comes from kind of an understatement of the idea of compensation. The word compensation was not something that states could agree upon because there was a clear opposition from developed countries. And instead, they agreed on this ill-defined concept of approaches to address loss and damage, which they have not agreed to translate into any sort of compensation. From a legal perspective, you could try to push a bit further and to look beyond climate treaties, perhaps interpreting human rights law, tort law, customary international law. But whichever field of law you look at, you will have the same kind of issue, which is that you will have to look at the general practice of states or at the general practice of companies to find that one state or one company is not acting up to the standard that society recognizes through practice. And the fact is that at the moment, no developed state provides really any form of compensation. So therefore, you cannot really find a legal standard to impose on other states. You could perhaps find a legal standard saying that states have to comply with climate treaties because most of them do. But if you don't have a climate treaty, including an obligation to give compensation, then it's quite difficult to find this norm in law. The legal interpretation is, of course, very conservative. And even if you could find a legal norm by interpretation of the prevention principle, which would be quite far-fetched, I think, there would be, I think, something my co-panelists have perhaps not emphasized enough, which is that we don't know where to draw the line between the global south and the global north. And I'm speaking from Hong Kong. I don't know which side Hong Kong is, for instance, or China for that matter. Like those newly developed countries that emit now a lot of greenhouse gases, and I suppose that India will be one of them in 20 or 30 years, a massive polluter, which is also massively affected by climate change. But is it a country that should pay compensation or a country that should receive compensation? Now, of course, the law is always for negotiations, and there are ongoing negotiations. For instance, under the concept of loss and damage that I mentioned before, to try to get some kind of compensation or something akin to compensation. I think there are three main issues here. The first one is like the sense that Dr. Dubash has mentioned, that you should choose between mitigation and adaptation. And I think this, of course, is mostly history. I think most people now understand that you need to do both, and you cannot just mitigate or just adapt. The second, I think the most obvious issue is the lack of political will. International law is based on consensus, and in principle, the single state can prevent the adoption of a treaty. So a consensus is very difficult to achieve on the idea that the most powerful states should pay something to other states. So it's a very difficult political issue to bring forward. But I think there's also a third political issue, which is the difficulty of identifying climate harm. And I think my co-panelist, for instance, Ms. Mishra has kind of mentioned that as well. Climate change is often exacerbating harm, but it's not really causing harm in an abstract, in isolation from other things. So the floodings that happen now in Pakistan would probably have been less severe if it was not for the increased temperature of the air that makes it possible for the air to contain more water, and then you have more rain falling. But that does not mean that an individual who is affected by climate change, it doesn't mean that one individual can say that they have been affected by climate change individually. I'm quite skeptical of the concept of climate migrant, for instance, because I don't think we can identify individuals who are migrating because of climate change. There are more people as a whole in the planet moving because of climate change, but you cannot identify causation at an individual level. And to turn this argument on the other way, you could also say that, well, there should be enlightened self-interest or more responsibility to help anyone who is in a situation of vulnerability, notwithstanding the cause of vulnerability. So I would perhaps reframe the argument and say that, yes, the rich countries have to pay, but not just for the consequences of climate change, not just for what they have caused, but for any harm they can help address. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Professor Meyer. Can I bring in Ms. Esther Stanford-Kose for that? Because when Professor Meyer says that you cannot really attribute climate change and the results thereof, how would your experience be, especially in the African region? Because, and even in the context of, say, the Pacific Islands, where you have the islands that are expected to sink, and that's because of sea level rise. So what would your take be on that when Professor Meyer says that you can't really attribute to climate change and its ramifications thereof?
Well, I think that's a matter of opinion and also scholarly research, where there's countless research that has been done that shows direct connections between climate change and actually migration and actually, dispossession of peoples. And so where we have climate change, oftentimes there's a growing recognition now of the notion of ecocide, for instance, including a definition that has been developed by consensus. And there are at least 10 countries around the world that recognize ecocide as a crime. Now, wherever you have ecocide, you also have genocide, which is not, the simple wanton destruction and killing of a people. It is actually a series of actions that bring about a people's inability to sustain themselves and live according to the way that they have been accustomed to living. So the question that we have here is, and I've listened very carefully to the arguments that have just been made, but the question comes up about, say, international law and whose law, whose framework, whose justice. Who are the key decision makers? Who holds the power to actually say that we cannot, make a direct link between climate change and any individuals? I would actually contest that. In the UK, for instance, there is, I'm part of an organisation called Plan B that has been supporting, a group of 3 young co-claimants based in the UK who have, mounted a legal action against the British government on that very basis, that there is a direct link between the climatic impacts that their families in the global south, in Africa, in parts of South America, in Asia, for instance, there's a direct link between certain climatic impacts there and these young people living in Britain who are affected because we are part of families, we are part of networks, we are part of communities who end up being called on to assist when there are, climate catastrophes, as it were. And of course, these arguments were not accepted by the British government. It is now subject of an appeal to the European courts in particular. But that is one of the issues that we have to contend with. We have to contend with the fact that a lot of what we're talking about is about will, political will, but it's also about power and who is holding the balance of power and how that power has been amassed. And that also includes the power to deny people an effective remedy, a right to a remedy and reparation. So I would argue that even if we can make that spurious argument for me around, well, there's no real international legal obligation, there are international obligations that have been signed up to that say states should not really commit or be complicit in acts of genocide. And equally, that will be the case with ecocide. So there are a number of international crimes, wrongs and harms that people who experience and communities and affected regions experience, that actually we can hold them to account. But what this also does demonstrate is that we cannot expect to use the existing legal institutions and justice frameworks to address these problems that humanity has never faced in this way before. And part of the repair has to be about either repairing the institutions that exist there, including the legal institutions and framework, or creating new mechanisms. And that is part of what some of us are involved in from below, because if we think about international law is also made by movements, by people who contest those boundaries that say, for instance, that slavery was legal. By whose law? By whose frameworks? By whose standards? The same thing around colonialism. By whose law? Whose frameworks? Whose standards? And the same arguments are being made today by those who use these arguments around, well, international law doesn't recognize this or that, to contest that and to create new spaces and actually to use the language that best suits what those movements are striving for. So it is always a contestation of power, but to remember that international law is as much made from those who resist the denial of international law and lawyers from above to deny those claims of those communities who are experiencing that death, that destruction, that dispossession from below.
Thank you, Mr. Esther Stanford-Kose. And the reform of the multilateral institutions insofar as climate debt financing is concerned is one aspect that I hope to touch in the course of this discussion. But before that, let me bring in Ms. Stuti Mishra. How would you respond to whether can attribute a particular climate event to global warming or climate change, or is there enough evidence to back those claims?
Right. So I'd say attribution does remain like a very scientific concept, I'd say, because like when you speak to a scientist, they will not make a very direct or clear assessment that yes, this is what climate change is doing. They will say that, oh, climate change has had this much role. This is how climate change changed the atmosphere around, like in Pakistan floods, even in Bangladesh floods and in other places, there has been a discussion about how the monsoon pattern has been changing and why Pakistan faces floods very frequently, or the fact that the warming has actually exacerbated certain aspects like glacier melting and other things. So they will always tell you these things in a very scientific lingo, and then when you're reporting on it, it is on you to sort of analyze it and put it out in a manner that people are able to understand, but at the same time you're not really contradicting or like misquoting the scientist. So on attribution front, I feel so there have been very different events, extreme weather events in South Asia of late. You can actually say certain things very clearly that they were entirely because of climate change, and then there are other events where definitely you will have these quotes from scientists where, oh, like, this is how it impacted and this is how it didn't. With heat waves, I feel like a lot of experts were on board with the fact that it was because of global warming that India's heat wave became record-breaking, Pakistan's heat wave became record-breaking. And how climate change had actually a lot more to do with heat wave than it does with maybe floods. But it doesn't mean that it is not playing a role. And even if it is making floods more frequent, even if it is making like flooding more large scale, that more areas are inundated now, people who had to prepare or rebuild their houses once in every 10 years will have to do it once in every 5 years. They are still victims of climate change. And that means that they will have to either migrate or spend a lot of their own money. Like in terms of countries, a lot of these countries, like firstly, I definitely want to say that countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, they have spent a lot of their own money as well. So it's not like anyone's waiting for, rich countries to come and give them funds before they start spending on adaptation or mitigation. India also has been putting a lot of their own money. So countries are already doing that. They are definitely trying to make, like you can always analyze it if it's good enough or not and how much money is going where, but at the same time, countries are having to spend on it because there's no other option. And at the same time, what really needs to be done is that first, that responsibility, I feel like that responsibility first needs to be identified and agreed upon. Like everybody else has said, that the principle has to be agreed upon, that the rich nations do owe reparations. And then you can probably have a framework where you decide that, okay, how much money needs to go where, or like what kind of events have more to do with climate change and less to do with climate change. But things like migration, things like the losses, the loss of life, and the way lives are changing for people, a lot of people who are just living at these hotspot areas, that is something that cannot be denied. And at the same time, there's enough proof of that. Like, you don't even need 10 different researchers for it. You can just go to an area and you can ask people, and they will tell you that things were not like this 10 years ago. They had to move from one place to another because their houses were getting flooded very frequently, or because it was getting too hot, or because their lives were unlivable back in an area. So there is very clear evidence in terms of how climate change has impacted a lot more people. Now, it had been impacting a lot of people, disasters had been impacting a lot of people for decades, but it has started impacting a lot more people now at a very large scale. And when you go on to report on migration, you will hear people coming up with those stories. And there are a lot of examples in South Asia for that matter, like people moving from different areas of Bangladesh to different areas and to India and to other places. All those things are happening because climate change and very frequent flooding is making their lives unlivable. And this year, I remember speaking to a lot of activists who were saying that more areas were impacted by Bangladesh floods this time. So if it used to be in a specific eastern area, it expanded to a lot more areas, and their lives were hampered in a manner that they had no other option but to move out, but to find different places. And a lot of them will continue to pay for those costs, will continue to face the consequences for decades and probably for their entire lives. People who have lost their houses in Pakistan and Afghanistan, they did not have a lot to begin with, but their houses are destroyed. The compensations are never enough, and sometimes you don't even get proper compensations. And you are basically left to fend for yourself for decades. And those impacts I feel like, can be attributed to climate change.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Timishra. Let me very quickly bring in Mr. Thwaites on what are his views on the whole discussion around attribution of a climate change event, and what would be the legal obligations for the developing countries, and what has caused the opposition so far from their end. Mr. Thwaites, and then I'll move on to Professor Dubash.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to hear Benoit's assessment that there isn't any international law obligations, because I think in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 4.3 and 4.4, it talks about developed country parties needing to provide new and additional financial resources to meet the full costs. And it sets out a bunch of activities, and they're not super well defined, and it's not a clear, like, developed countries need to meet the full costs of all of climate change, but there are a set of commitments there. And then in Article 4.4, there is a further commitment around helping particularly vulnerable countries to meet the cost of adaptation. Then in 2009, we had the commitment as part of the Copenhagen Accord that was formalized with the COP decision in 2010 at Cancun, that developed countries would mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020. And that was reaffirmed in Paris and extended out to 2025. Now, they've not met that. And a big part of the problem is that there wasn't as Benoit mentioned, there isn't a great definition, there isn't a clear-cut definition of who developed countries are. I've done a bunch of research on the differing opinions there. I think it's fair to say that it is certainly the Annex II parties under the convention, but whether it includes other countries as well, that's a matter that some other countries have sort of elected into joining some of the OECD reporting and saying, yeah, we're willing to be bound by that commitment, or we're part of that commitment. But fundamentally, the part of the challenge with the 100 billion was there was no effort sharing approach, no formula, no criteria of which country should do what to meet that goal. And so what that meant was that when, for example, in the United States, Trump was elected, the US climate finance flows, which have never been huge, but they dropped down. and the Europeans were sort of having to carry a lot of the slack there. They weren't particularly happy about that, as you can understand. But that's one of the real challenges is a lot of the commitments are collective. They apply to relatively fuzzily defined terms of developed countries, and so it's hard to enforce. And they failed to meet it in 2020. They're still failing. I doubt they will have met it this year. Maybe next year they'll meet the 100 billion. But I think that's been one of the challenges, is that what's the penalty for failure? There is no great enforcement mechanism. But I would push back a little bit. I think there are some obligations. I'm not a lawyer, but having talked to a lot of international lawyers, there are others who have felt that there are provisions that would push that. The other thing I would say, though, is that I think we should think about the term rich world more broadly than just governments. The richest and most polluting individuals and companies transcend national borders, and so one of the really interesting cases right now is that there's a Peruvian farmer who lives on at the foot of a glacial lake, and the glacier is melting, and that's making the lake increase in size. And there's a real risk of a glacial lake outburst flood, which are devastating. And he, partnering with the German NGO German Watch, who I work with on climate finance matters, they actually have brought a case under German law, arguing that because German law talks about sort of neighbors causing harm, and the definition of neighborhood is very wide. It doesn't just include within Germany, and so they've made the case, and this case is going forward, that that RWE, the German energy company RWE, should pay 0.47% of the cost of dealing with this lake. And really, it's not so much about the money, but it's about establishing that principle that you can, based on a number of studies, RWE's share of global carbon emissions was estimated to be 0.47%, and therefore they're bringing that case and arguing. I think it's about 20,000 euros is what they're trying to get RWE to pay. So it's really, the legal costs alone that they've been paying just to bring the case is probably far exceeding that. But the principle would be about establishing attribution and getting that as a legal decision in the German courts. And I think that's a really fascinating thing to sort of follow, and because I think if that happens, then you could see more cases like that. But I think fundamentally, we know that there are billionaires with individual carbon footprints larger than small island states. You've probably heard the statistic of 71% of global emissions between 98 and 2015, and I think that study was the one that they're using in the RWE case, have been linked to just 100 companies. Now, of course, it's not that those companies are wholly responsible. We're all buying those products, but that level of attribution is possible, or it's getting more possible, and attribution science is getting better, and it is being mobilized in the courts. And so yeah, when we say the rich world in the title of the discussion, rich countries, certainly we need to be pushing on that front. But I think we can also be looking at how the richest individuals and companies, no matter where they're located, pay their fair share of the climate bill too.
Thank you, Mr. Thwaites. Let me bring in Professor Navroz Dubash. Professor Dubash, you have written extensively on climate adaptation, particularly in low and middle income countries, as an approach that can be considered. Now, since low income countries are in the process of building their infrastructure, they do have the opportunity to lock in low carbon infrastructure rather than high carbon infrastructure. So with particular reference to India, and very briefly at that, do you think that India or the global south in particular, do they have the institutional mechanisms in place to deal with the challenge that lies ahead of us? And again, with reference to India, are you seeing efforts to that end on the ground? Say, for example, we have the Smart Cities mission that is designed to have sustainable green cities. Are we doing enough in that end to build that kind of resilience within our systems, within our cities, so that we can deal with the effects of climate change?
Right. Well, thanks, Apurva. You've dangled some very provocative questions at me, but there were a whole bunch more in the discussion that just occurred that I was hoping to also pick up on. So let me actually just pick up on the previous discussion first, and then even more briefly come to your points. On attribution, I actually think attribution science is getting pretty good to the point where it is now being used in litigation. In our chapter in the IPCC, we pointed out that there's, I think, a total of on the order of close to 40 countries where you've seen climate litigation. 18 of those cases are in the developing world. And what climate attribution can say is that climate change makes X or Y weather event so many times more likely. It's the language of probabilities, and it's, I think, a test ongoing in the courts. And I'd be curious to hear what Professor Mayer has to say about the litigation experience. But I think we're seeing that. I just want to kind of fast forward here to a phrase that Joe Thwaites used, which is, and it maybe ties to your question, Apurva, which is about enlightened self-interest, right? How far can enlightened self-interest take us in all of this? And to use that as a bridge to your question about India, I think that we are, in fact, tunneling through in some dimensions to low carbon futures where the co-benefits of doing so, that is the development benefits that also bring mitigation gains, are apparent. So, for example, I think we're trying hard with building cleaner cities, less congested cities. I don't think we're going quite far enough. We are adding a lot more renewable energy. The conversation about whether or not we both add renewable energy and coal is ongoing in India. I think it's very clear that everybody feels we should not, as a poor developing country, we should not be foregoing our energy needs for development. Energy is crucial for human development increases. And if the cost of too rapid a pivot to renewable energy means that we forego energy needs, I think that's not a bargain that people make. Do we have to make that bargain? I think that's where the debate really lies. So, but this kind of enlightened self-interest argument on mitigation in some global south countries takes you part of the way, but making those pivots often requires huge financial and transaction costs, and those have to come from somewhere. So, for example, if we move away from a coal economy, it also has spillover effects to the railways in India, which are cross-subsidized by coal, and huge millions of migrants depend on subsidized passenger rail, subsidized by coal at the moment, coal freight. So these disruptive effects ripple through the society. Plus, capital is scarce in India. The opportunity cost of capital is high. So should we be actually using our limited capital for these purposes as opposed to building health and education and so on and so forth? So the enlightened self-interest argument on the mitigation developing country side only goes so far. On the developed country side, you have, for example, now just transition packages being put together, most notably for South Africa, with the argument being, listen, if the rich world puts together these packages and that then helps the developing world tunnel through to a low carbon future, it's in their enlightened self-interest. We actually haven't seen delivery of those packages yet. So that's a little bit of a worry in terms of enlightened self-interest. But the bigger point is we are unlikely to see that happening for adaptation. Because if money goes to the developing world to pivot faster, the developed world shares in that gain. For adaptation or loss and damage, they don't necessarily share in that gain, right? And so I think we are in a world here where whether we agree entirely with Benoit on how strongly the international agreement provides hooks for compensation, and I tend to agree that there are some of those hooks, they're not very well defined, they're hard to follow through. I think at the bottom, at the end, I end up where Esther does on the fact that much of this is around the language of power. And how do we hold to account the rich world? One of the ways that people are talking about is through litigation. And I think we should think about that. The other, frankly, is how do we mobilize public opinion in the developed world around issues like compensation and not just around issues like coal phase down, like moving away from gas and so on and so forth. So in other words, how do we mobilize public opinion around the adaptation side of the agenda and not just on the mitigation side of the agenda? So I think the enlightened self-interest argument has scope to be worked, but ultimately I think we have to kind of go beyond that and figure out how we challenge some of the power relations that lock us into where we are today, which is that the vulnerable are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
Right. Thank you, Professor Dubash. Let me bring in Professor Benoit Maire and have him respond to the observations of the other panelists. And also, other question that Professor Maire can choose to respond is, when we talk about holding private companies accountable rather than countries, would that also stand the test of legality?
Thank you very much. So I think I completely agree with the last point by Professor Dubash, that it's a matter of power, and it's really important to try to change public opinion in Western countries. I'm absolutely not opposed, actually completely in favor of advocacy at the political level. My only argument was on the content of the law. And on the content of the law, I think there is a bit of wishful thinking in what has been said before, in terms of attribution and in terms of legal interpretation. In terms of attribution, yes, some disasters become more frequent. Yes, there is an attribution science showing an increase in statistics in the probability of some events. But then let me cite you the foresight report by the UK government on migration and global environmental change. It says, I quote, "The range and complexity of the interactions between drivers of migration means that it will rarely be possible to distinguish individuals for whom environmental factors are the sole driver, quotation marks, environmental migrants," end of quote. So I think the migration scientists, migration specialists or experts will tell you that it's almost impossible to find an individual that you can say would not have moved because of climate change. Climate change makes some disasters more likely. It makes it more likely that there will be a social and economic push and pull factors that will make the migration more likely. But then it's about probability. It's not about binary determination. And that's quite different, because you don't have someone who you could say would not have moved but for climate change. You have an increased probability of a population migrating. And that makes it much more difficult to attribute responsibility. On the ecocide argument, I don't think ecocide has ever been interpreted by any court, at least, as applicable to climate change or to something similar to climate change. Who would be sued? Which individual? Because ecocide is an individual crime. Which individual would be sued, and on which basis? When we are 7 billion people responsible, some of us more than others. But putting the blame on one or a few individuals would be very artificial. Then coming back to the climate treaties, which Joe mentions of the UNFCCC articles 4.3, Joe forgot one word. Full cost, actually full agreed cost. So it's the cost that has been agreed by Annex 2 parties. Annex 2 parties only pay what they have agreed to pay. Article 4.4 is not the cost of adaptation, it is cost of adaptation without the. So it's only some cost of adaptation. And Daniel Bodensky has written on this, saying that this omission of the word the that was removed by the US during the negotiations aims at making this article ineffective in practice. It's not a legal basis for compensation or for finance, for any level, any externally defined level of adaptation finance. Of course, it can be used in political advocacy, but I think we have to face the fact that climate treaties have been negotiated, they have been adopted by states like the US, and they have been very carefully drafted to prevent any such argument. The Cancun Agreement is not legally binding, it's not a treaty. The Paris Agreement does not contain obligations on finance, it contains an aspirational objective on finance, and I think it alludes or it mentions the $100 billion objective, but not as an obligation for states, as an aspiration that states have to try to achieve. And I can't imagine any state being sued because this objective has not been achieved. I have not seen this happen, at least. Now, turning to Professor Dubash, mention of 40 countries in which attribution science had been, I think that's what you said more or less, had been recognized in litigation. I'm not aware of any of those countries. The number of countries in which litigation has led to climate compensation is 0. There has been one case in Pakistan where the government has been found legally responsible for implementing national adaptation policy, but it's domestic, it's not about compensation. There has been a few successful cases on mitigation, but not on reparation. The case of RWE against, the Peruvian farmer against RWE in Germany is still a pending case. It's not been decided. The only thing that the Court of Appeal has accepted is that they will look at the evidence. So it's not a victory for the plaintiff, it's just the absence of an early failure. And I think the odds are frankly against this case because it's very difficult to interpret tort law, and that responds, I think, to Apoorv's question. If you want to interpret tort law, you have to find that one person has caused harm to their neighbor. Neighbor can be, as has been said, interpreted very broadly, but still you have to have this causation. And 0.47% is not usually considered as a sufficient contribution to cause harm. Plus, I just want to come back to the 0.47%. This is the proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions attributed to RWE. It is not the proportion of the wrongful emissions. Some of the emissions probably are not wrongful, right? I mean, we all use some greenhouse gas. We all contribute to causing greenhouse gas emissions. So we will have to look at, among those 0.47%, which part of it is wrongful, which part of it is unlawful. And if you look at the consequence of those emissions affecting the Peruvian farmer, which part of it results from unlawful emissions as opposed to lawful emissions? And I don't think we can argue that all emissions are unlawful when we are all emitting greenhouse gas emissions all the time.
Can we have Professor Dubash respond to Professor Meyer, please? Yes.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to respond. I just want to clarify that I wasn't making the case that certainly that all these instances of litigation successfully use attribution science, but that there are growing numbers of cases of litigation. In some cases, they have led to decisions with implications for mitigation, and that the solidity of the attribution science is probably a precondition for the growing effectiveness of these litigation cases, because I think Benoit is right that you have to provide that kind of causal story, which is exactly what attribution science is trying to do. So the direction of travel is more litigation, the direction of travel is more robust attribution. And I'm just sort of juxtaposing those two trends, right? So I don't want to overstate this case. And I'm not an expert on the specifics of litigation, but I don't think one can dismiss the growing precision and the growing acceptance of attribution science and its use in legal fora in the years to come. It's a speculation, I admit that, but I think that it's probably fair speculation.
Right. Thank you, Professor Dubash. And I'd now like to move on in the discussion and bring in Ms. Esther Stanford-Coze. Ms. Coze, it has been generally accepted that the Paris Climate Agreements and the 100 billion that was to be transferred to the poorer nations, that hasn't happened. In fact, recent OECD reports say that 80% of that money, in fact, has been funneled into investor-friendly projects in middle-income countries in the developed world. So there's something seriously wrong with the intent of the developed countries, the rich countries, when it comes to climate justice. Because again, on one hand, you have Mozambique, which is having to take out loans in the face of Cyclone Idai. How does the two reconcile? Would you also question the intent of the developed world when it comes to climate justice and climate debt?
Oh, most definitely, because there is a fear of even, I mean, the way in which we've been discussing so far, there is just a huge fear of actually honouring arguments for reparations. And so it gets reduced to notions of loss and damage, which are very slippery and have been hard to implement. And once again, the intent shows that there is a failure to even mitigate for the worst impacts of the climate and ecological crisis already, which is happening now. It's not something in the future. And this is to do with, historic patterns of colonization, and also the power or the weaker condition or position of many countries in the so-called global south in the international arena. So there's a huge gap between the intent and the actual practice and how that gets adopted, and that will continue to happen. Because what we're seeing is that, the arguments that are coming really from below, which are coming from movements and states are now adopting, they are still not being accepted, in particular in countries of the so-called global north, or the rich countries, which I know it's not easy to always differentiate what we're talking about here conceptually. And we've got a long way to go. And I think things won't necessarily change until we begin to also influence the hearts and minds of the majority populations in many of these countries that are being held accountable, countries, and also we can talk about corporations, but corporations are normally registered somewhere. They're normally corporations that come out of the so-called global north. So we can still look at who the shareholders are, who the directors are, and still, do some level of attribution. And so the focus must also be looking at the changes that people and movements and communities are making on the ground, and actually trying to transform their understandings of the situation so that they can begin to put pressure on their so-called governments. They can actually engage in successful advocacy campaigns around divestment from fossil fuel kind of productions and economies and companies and so forth. And that is a very important model. If we look at, I think history matters. If we look at some of the biggest kind of injustices that have happened to people. And I speak from somebody who comes from a community, a nation of people that were enslaved and colonized. Part of how different forms of that enslavement and direct colonialism were ended was because not only of the liberation movements that came from the people themselves, but also the internationalist solidarity and supporting movements in the global north and the sites of empire, for instance the abolitionist movement. And when ordinary people begin to see the actual cost and the death and the destruction of us having particular lifestyles and being, high consumerists and having models of development dangled in our faces that make us want to aspire to, aspects of property and so forth that actually are reinforcing, this addiction to fossil fuels. That is when we begin to see some of the changes. So I think we need to also pay attention to how we can shift that power and recognize that even now, communities are forced to engage in their own types of transformative adaptation, because in many parts of the world, there are fragile states, because these are states that were really imposed upon people. They are not states of the people. And we're even seeing that now happening in Pakistan in terms of the way in which communities are trying to, deal with the catastrophe that has happened there, and trying to meet their own needs of, not being able to just rely or wait on aid that is coming, humanitarian aid that is coming from overseas.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Stanford-Kose. Mr. Joe Thwaites, listening to all my distinguished set of panelists this evening on argumentative Indians, one gets a sense that although we have one climate, we are tackling it on a country-by-country basis. Differences in contributions to the stock of greenhouse gases, debt levels, and climate experiences have turned this whole debate into a country versus country deadlock. You are an international climate financing advocate, someone who asks the rich countries to do their share of responsibilities to hold up their end of the bargain. In your opinion, what would an integrated, comprehensive international climate finance framework look like? What would be the best way forward to ensure that we do not lack the funds for the global south when it comes to, say, climate financing projects?
Thanks. I mean, that's a huge question. I think, one of the things that the Paris Agreement does that marked a particular step change is that up until then, COP decisions and previous provisions were all focused around developed to developing country finance flows. And the Paris Agreement, as part of Article 2, so the overarching long-term goals, has 3 of them. One is about mitigation, one is about adaptation, and the third one is about finance. And it talks about the idea of making finance flows consistent with low emissions and climate resilient development pathways. And it, for the first time, talked about shifting finance flows and transforming the finance system in a much broader way than had ever been spoken about before under the UNFCCC. And I think that was really remarkable and helpful. Again, as always with UNFCCC treaties and associated COP decisions, there's always a degree of constructive ambiguity, and so it didn't clearly specify, what exactly that means, making finance flows consistent. But since then, you've seen the way the financial sector has kind of has recognized that and has interpreted it, particularly in light of divestment movements, fossil fuel divestment movements, to sort of be around shifting finance and to be looking at the system comprehensively. Now, within that, it still includes north-south finance flows, and I think in Article 9 of the Paris Agreement talks about that as well. Although, albeit with sort of provisions about broadening the contributors and getting other countries to be providing finance too. But I think that what is really interesting is that in the last 7 years since the Paris Agreement was created, that the Article 2.1c, this finance alignment provision, has really helped spark a lot of new thinking in the financial sector. It's nowhere near fast enough. There's still an awful lot of greenwashing going on, but I think it is really interesting there that for the first time the UN Climate Convention started to grapple with the full scale of what the kind of financial shifts that are needed, because north-south finance flows alone would not be enough. There's a need to shift domestic finance flows within every country to make sure that they're getting out of fossil fuels and other high emissions activities that are incompatible with the safe climate. And so I think that's what is interesting, is it's about domestic and international finance flows. It's about public and private finance flows, and it's what I see in the annual COP negotiations. Some countries want to interpret it, just take a piece of that and just run with that one piece. So a lot of developed countries often just want to talk about private finance. Some developing countries just want to talk about the north-south flows as has traditionally been the focus. But I think what's really important is the fact that it includes everything, and we need to move on all fronts. And it's not about, fundamentally, it should not be about trading off one for the other, or saying, oh, we'll move on that, but we won't move on these other things. And part of the structure of the Paris Agreement that is innovative is this idea of 5-year cycles. You have the global stock take, you assess progress. We're just entering, it's just heating up the first global stock take. And a big question that they're going to have to grapple with, in addition to looking at progress on mitigation, in addition to looking at progress on adaptation, is how are we progressing on finance? And so that's certainly going to include looking at the 100 billion, but it's also going to include looking at financial flows much more broadly. And what's the challenge is that the parties to the Paris Agreement are national governments, but the finance sector is far broader. It includes international financial institutions. It includes private institutions. It includes households. And yet it's the governments that are coming together and discussing this. And so there are challenges in terms of accountability, because often governments love to be able to point the finger and say, oh, these other actors can do it, and they should be moving more on that. But they're the ones who are assembling at the COPs, making the commitments. And so it's fundamentally it's about how those governments, as much as we need to bring in all aspects of society, look at the private sector, it's about how the governments engage with that and hold the private sector accountable, because they're the ones who are making the commitments. But I do think that has been a really interesting development. It's by no means resolved everything, but I think just starting to look at the full scale of the transformation that's needed has been really helpful.
Right, Mr. Thwaites, but again, continuing with you, the World Bank reports that for every dollar that you spend on climate resilience now, you save up to almost $6 in future disasters. Now, many developing countries can't be expected to make that sort of investments, and many don't qualify for concessionary loans from international lending institutions because they are above a certain benchmark or a criteria of gross national income. So in your opinion, do you think that there is a need for an overhaul of international lending mechanisms, especially insofar as financing climate aid projects are concerned?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the international financial architecture is not fit for purpose. We've seen that from the pandemic. We've seen it from climate change. I think there is a growing consensus among all countries that it's not delivering, that it's not actually capable of doing what's necessary. What we see, though, is still there's a lack, particularly at the G7 and even more so at the G20. It's those governments that are going to have to take decisive action to start to reform the system. You see, for example, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Miriam Motley, has put forward some brilliant and really visionary ideas for how the system could be reformed. And she is from one of those countries that you mentioned, that a country that is too wealthy to qualify for grant finance from the World Bank, or for most grant finance from the World Bank. And she points out that, yes, that Barbados is a relatively wealthy country, but when they get hit by a hurricane, it can wipe out the entire national GDP. And so she has been pushing, along with a lot of other small island states and climate vulnerable countries, to start to think about how do we change these criteria. Of course, income is a really important metric, but it shouldn't be the only one. You should be looking at climate vulnerability. There's a lot of inertia in the system. There's a lot of institutional conservatism, and just we've always done it this way. We don't want to change. But I do think, and obviously right now within the G20, there's G20 governments are far apart on many issues, and so getting movement there is a challenge. But I think there is a growing recognition that the system is not well designed to address climate change, and there is pressure building about the kind of reforms that would be needed to do that, including looking at how you assess countries' eligibility for financial support, and the types of instruments as well, and changing those, thinking more innovatively about how you get finance flowing really, really fast when a disaster hits, because the traditional climate funds are doing often some really, really good work, but the project cycles for those, you have to put your project together. It takes several years before it even gets gavelled through by the board and approved, and then another several months before the money starts flowing in the best case scenario. That's not going to work when we're dealing with climate disasters, when we're dealing with loss and damage. We are going to need different systems, and that's why you see these discussions around a loss and damage finance facility around reforming, particularly debt relief when countries are hit by disasters. But yeah, as I said, I think a lot of the agenda that Mia and More Motley has been pushing internationally is really worth a look at.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Thwaites. I'd love to keep going this discussion going, but unfortunately, we do have paucity of time here. So I'd invite you all for your concluding comments. And one common question that I'll ask all of you is, we have seen how COP26 went. So if there's one outcome that you're hoping for in COP27, the forthcoming COP27, what would that be? Let's begin with Ms. Stuti Mishra, please.
Yeah, hi. So, lots of thoughts actually. I don't know how I can summarize all of them. But one thing that definitely was seeming like a very big takeaway was like this major divide in terms of like where things are and where things should be. And even ahead of COP27, if I can speak from a journalistic point of view and from the media point of view, I would definitely like to see just this conversation going. Firstly, like my expectation is very basic at this point, that at least the conversation should continue even during COP as well, continuing about loss and damage, because on one side, yes, there's demand for climate finance, for climate loss and damage, for like a very clear mechanism for having it enforced. But you do see that there's also a lot of climate skepticism even among you audience and readers for impact of climate within their own country, not just about another country. Like it becomes like a issue for a bit later that they accept that there's historical injustice. Some people are still not believing that what's happening to themselves is actually a reality, or it's actually because of climate change. So from there, bringing a conversation to this point, that they acknowledge that certain countries are more affected and that it is not their fault, it is the historical injustices that have played a role. And also at the same time, like just so many things are just coming in together, because we are talking about a very wide concept of justice here. So I'd like a lot more coverage, to be honest, on COP27 this time. And I hope that, with Pakistan floods and with so many other extreme weather events, there will be a lot more conversation in media about it. And probably that will somehow create a little bit of push for this cause as well, so that when leaders are going in there's actually a discussion which is from the point of view of developed countries as well. Otherwise, I honestly, in my personal opinion, don't see COP summits as a very inclusive place. It's not very easy for people from global south to go and participate in it, to be able to voice themselves. And it's like it's a very, very limited space confined to specific types of people. The locations that they choose are also not like, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to be able to fly to Sharm el Sheikh. The hotel costs are like just crazy high. So I'd like to see things on those basic levels, more discussion, more conversation from the point of view of those who are affected, people going out and being able to say that climate change affected them personally in this capacity, so that people on the other side can hear that the causes of migration, the causes of the way their lives are changing is because of climate change. And then for media to be able to talk about science as it is, and also about the human rights aspect of it.
Thank you, Ms. Stuti Mishra. Can we bring in Professor Navroz Dubash for your concluding remarks, and what would that one expected outcome be at COP27 that you're most looking forward to?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on some of the conversation around finance, and I do agree with Joe that this conversation that we've been having about, in a sense, sort of mainstreaming finance or thinking through how climate considerations kind of get woven into financial decision making in a more integrated way is a really important conversation. I do worry that it'll end up being a conversation that will focus more on mitigation financing, which is important. And I started out saying this. I wonder what it means actually for adaptation financing, and the amount of money in the multilateral development banks, the bilaterals, so on, is just limited and unequal to the task. The big pots of money are really sitting in on the private side, and I just don't see how one can actually access that for adaptation purposes. So I think there's it's an important question to think through harder. You know, the scale of money and the possible sources of it, and the likelihood that it will flow seem limited. Which brings me back to your question about COP27. And this is supposed to be a developing country COP. I think developing countries will be looking for some kind of some sort of real litmus tests, whether there is and I'm not as steeped in this as Joe is, but what are the benchmarks of success or benchmarks of progress really when it comes to building some kind of mechanism actually around loss and damage, whether it becomes what is the benchmark beyond creating a process for adaptation, though even just creating a clear process in the UN negotiating framework context is seen as a mark of success. How will we? What will we do with this dangling $100 billion, and is that ever going to be sort of satisfactorily put on the table? Will we see a proliferation, but more important, the credible proliferation of just transition financing plans across countries? These are all sort of things to look out for. I do think that we're going to see a COP27 in the shadow of energy security, food crisis, the turmoil in Europe, and I worry that it'll really limit the attention given to these issues at a time when we really need that attention. Sorry to be a bit pessimistic about it, but I worry about maintaining the urgency around many of these issues and keeping the focus on what matters for the poorest, who we've seen this year bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change.
Right. Thank you, Professor Navroz Dubash. And now on to Ms. Stanford Koze. Do we have any reasons to be optimistic ahead of COP27, or do you share the sentiments of Professor Dubash? Ms. Koze.
I share some of those sentiments because certainly from a movements perspective, and not just being involved in reparations movements, but also environmental movements in Europe, such as Extinction Rebellion, International Solidarity Network, our view has always been that these COPs, are actually anti-people, and they are anti, communities of resistance. And Shruti has already spoken about how exclusive they can be and alienating, and just the cost alone of communities trying to get there to exercise their voice. What I feel needs to be recognized is also the transformations that communities themselves are having to engage in. So who have lost faith in government, to be quite honest with you, including some of their own governments in the global south. And this is part of the problem. People have been forced into relationships of subjugation and domination that are not of their making, and they are constantly resisting that. And for them, it is about genocide. It is about ecocide. It is about the fact that when people are having to flee because of climate catastrophes that have been exacerbated, and one would argue also created in terms of the debt, the climate and ecological debt that richer nations and corporations and also individuals within different parts of the world have created. They are often met, these people who are fleeing are often met with militarization of borders and deportations. And we saw in Morocco how literally, a whole group of Africans were just killed because they were trying to cross the border. So people themselves are having to engage in these transformative adaptations themselves. And it is connected to people trying to reclaim land, stewardship over land, not land as property, but also their right to not have lands taken away under the guise of greenwashing, sort of protectionist measures, that reinforce that system of coloniality. And indigenous peoples around the world, that is a key demand that they've been making around land back. And this is shared by many African and diaspora communities in actually the global north, who are equally dispossessed, equally experiencing the worst kind of manifestations of the climate and ecological crisis in terms of environmental racism and so forth. So for me, what is hopeful and promising are those actions that movements, citizens movements from below, and I'll name Extinction Rebellion as one of them because, you know, I'm part of one of the, as I said, the Extinction Rebellion Internationalist Solidarity Network, but also how those movements are holding their governments to account and are forcing their governments to try and wake up to this issue. That is what I feel we need to hear the reporting on, that vision of a new world that is being transformed. And for us in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, we articulate this notion of what we refer to as planet repairs, which is a holistic notion of reparations that recognizes that the harm that has been done and continues to be done is not just harm to us as people, yeah, it's also harm to our planet and our relationship with Mother Earth, and that we need to repair our way of relating to our Mother Earth. And that means that we have to recognize that nexus between reparatory justice, environmental justice, and cognitive justice. And we have to move away from this notion that we can literally pillage the earth and plunder it without consequence, and that we know that we are interconnected, and therefore communities themselves, we have to go back to land, we have to go back to community, we have to go back to mutual aid, these basic building blocks of society in order to get us through these very perilous times.
Right, thank you, Mr. Stanford Kose. And now on to Mr. Joe Thwaites, and thereafter Professor Benoit Maire. Very briefly, what would your concluding remarks be? And do you agree with the sentiments that COP27 is an exclusive platform that actually has outlived its purpose? Or is there some cause for optimism for the rest of the planet?
I mean, it's certainly, yeah, not an inclusive space. It's very, you know, you have to be accredited. There are huge financial barriers, particularly this year with the hotel costs. I don't think it's outlived its purpose, though. I think it's the only thing we have. You know, it's sort of the, if we didn't have it, the saying goes, we would invent it. We need it. We need a space, and fundamentally, we need a space where, unlike the G20, unlike the G7, unlike the Security Council, this is a space where, at least nominally, every country is equal. Every country gets to take the floor and have their voice heard, which is not the case for most other international fora. So I think that you know, it is frustrating. It's not ideal, but it's better than a lot of the other alternatives. I think we are now moving from, you know, I think Glasgow last year's COP26 sort of marked the end of the era of negotiation, which had been happening for pretty much basically 30 years. And the idea now is that we're in the era of implementation. We have long-term goals, we have individual country commitments, we have the processes to monitor progress. We have an awful lot of pledges. We have an awful lot of great rhetoric, you know, and plenty of pledges on finance. You know, at Glasgow and in the years leading up to that. But now we need to see action on delivery, as Professor Dubash mentioned. On a lot of these finance goals, the jury is still very much out on is that finance actually going to be forthcoming. I think that's going to be a key thing. But then there is, as I said, we're at the end of the year of negotiation, but actually not quite, because we are now negotiating a new collective finance goal for the post-2025 period. And so that is also a key thing to watch. And as others have mentioned, the loss and damage issue, how to move that forward. What you know, beyond sort of there's a lot of debate about legal form and the characteristics of a facility, but actually what would that mean in terms of flows? What would it mean for people on the ground that are facing losses and damages? For them, it's not about where what fund the money comes from or how it's labeled. It's about, does it arrive in time, and does it help them when they need it most? So I think that's, we need to be looking at delivery. I get very frustrated when at high-level summits we just get new pledges on top of old unmet pledges. So I think that's a real thing, is that I think we have enough finance pledges now. We need to actually have some accountability on delivering them.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Twites. And now finally off to Professor Benoit Maire. I'm once again coming to you last, but you do have the final word on this discussion this evening. And again, your hopes for the forthcoming COP27 and what would the outcomes be?
Okay, thank you. It's a very huge responsibility, and I'm probably the worst person to conclude because I'm very pessimistic on COP27 or on the things we have talked about. I mean, we spoke about climate finance, and indeed, climate finance is increasing, but it's mostly going to mitigation, or when we speak about something as mitigation, is adaptation. Adaptation is not the same as compensation, right? It comes with conditions. You get the money if you implement something that we, the donor, has imposed on you, whereas compensation is you receive the money, whatever you do. And very little of climate finance, especially from cooperation, goes to developing countries as any form of adaptation finance, let alone any sort of compensation. Then speaking about climate litigation, I think perhaps it has some potential, but I don't think it's going to change the system. I don't think litigation can ever change the system. It can change the political system, but not the economic system. I don't see how the court could impose systemic structural reparation by every greenhouse gas polluter for the benefit of everyone affected as a consequence of it. That would be something that will have to be negotiated and adopted by lawmakers and not by courts. There's also a risk of harm, however. Litigation can cause ill-advised policies, and I think that's the case of one of the most spoken about judgments or gender against the Netherlands, which led the Netherlands to take ill-fitted policies that prevented the importation of waste, for instance, and led to more landfilling, and the total, in my calculation, was an increase in global emissions. So it can be counterproductive as well. What about political advocacy? I think that's probably the best shot we have. But compensation is something that is very hard to sell, especially if you're talking to, the countries that have the most political power are those from whom you want compensation. There's also a risk of causing harm through ill-advised advocacy. I believe that the case of climate migration is one where, speaking about climate refugees as a threat justifying mitigation action has led to militarization of migration and to policies against migrants. We should never present climate migrants or migrants of any sort as a threat to the receiving countries. They are a benefit to the receiving countries. Part of the advocacy about climate migration has used climate migrants as a threat that should justify more climate action. Now, what about COP27 in particular? Really, I don't know what to expect from it. Probably very incremental, minor changes. I do hope that the loss and damage mechanism will continue to progress, very small steps, but towards something akin to some form of compensation. But I think it will take a lot of time to have any sort of compensation there. I just hope that nothing worse will be adopted. And in particular, I'm kind of concerned by the language on migration in the COP21 decision, for instance, which is still lingering around the loss and damage mechanism. I don't think it's productive to try to isolate migration, but it could be useful for a loss and damage mechanism to speak about financial obligations related to addressing loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baer. Indeed, whichever side of the fence you may be sitting on, what is undeniable is that climate change and its ramifications is now not just the problem of the low-income countries. It is a global issue, and that will ultimately require collective action to address the future of not just you and I, but our coming generations. and climate justice may just be the way out towards ensuring environmental sustainability. On that note, Professor Benoit Maire, Professor Navroz Dubash, Ms. Stuti Mishra, Ms. Esther Stanford-Jose, and Mr. Joe Thwaites, thank you so much for joining us this evening at Argumentative Indians. We have been most enriched by your viewpoints and insights. And that's our program, ladies and gentlemen. Argumentative Indians is India's fastest growing thought platform, and I'm Bhuvan Apurva Jha. You can follow me on Twitter at Bhuvan_Apurv. For those of you who are watching us on YouTube, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Argumentative Indians so that you can hear about our latest presentations. You can also subscribe to our official YouTube channel or go to our website, www.argumentativeindians.com. If you've subscribed already, please do ensure to leave us a review. And if you do want us to give us some feedback, reach out to us. Our email is in the description box below. And before I take your leave, dear viewer, let us know your views on whether the rich countries should indeed foot the climate.